After 3 years of silence in his workshop, the first hammer blow from a 9-year-old boy awakened in Frank what he thought he had buried forever. The smell of sawdust still haunts my dreams, even though I haven't touched a piece of wood in 3 years. I am Frank Kowalski, 74 years old, and I used to be the kind of man who could build anything with his hands. Kitchen cabinets, bedroom sets, rocking chairs that would last 3 generations. If you needed it made from wood, you came to Frank Kowalski's workshop behind the house on Maple Street in Des Moines, Iowa. But that was before Linda got sick, before I learned that all the skill in the world cannot fix a human heart that has decided to stop working properly. My hands shake now when I hold my morning coffee, not from age but from the emptiness that fills them where purpose used to live. These fingers that once guided a router with the precision of a surgeon, that could feel the grain of oak through half an inch of varnish, now spend their days turning the pages of magazines. I don't really read and adjusting the volume on a television that talks to itself more than it talks to me. The calluses are fading, replaced by the soft skin of a man who no longer has meaningful work to do with his body. Linda used to say, my hands were the most beautiful part of me. Not because they were pretty to look at, but because of what they could create from nothing but rough lumber and imagination. She would sit in the workshop on summer evenings while I worked, reading her romance novels and occasionally looking up to watch me transform a pile of boards into something useful and lasting. The workshop smelled like pine sol and wood stain and the lavender lotion Linda used on her hands. A combination that meant home and contentment and the kind of love that doesn't need words to explain itself. We were married 47 years when she died. 47 years of shared morning coffee and evening news, of her gentle corrections when I got too loud about politics, and my patient listening when she worried about our son Michael, who lived too far away and called too infrequently. Linda had a way of humming while she folded laundry. Always the same melody that I never identified, but that became the soundtrack of our ordinary happiness. She would hum that melody while I worked in the shop, and sometimes I would catch myself humming along while I sanded a piece of cherry wood until it felt like silk under my palm. The house feels like a museum now, full of furniture I built for a woman who isn't here to use it anymore. The dining room table where we ate 47 years of meals together now serves as a surface for the mail I don't open, and the newspapers I don't finish reading. The rocking chair I made for Linda's 50th birthday sits empty by the window where she used to watch the neighborhood children walk to school. Its runners worn smooth by decades of gentle motion that has stopped forever. I wake up every morning at 5:30 without an alarm, a habit formed by 50 years of construction work that my body refuses to abandon, even though there is nowhere I need to be and nothing urgent waiting for my attention. The silence that greets me each dawn is complete and overwhelming, broken only by the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic from people who still have purposes that require them to be somewhere specific at appointed times. My morning routine has become a carefully choreographed dance with loneliness, each step designed to fill time without requiring too much thought or decision making. Coffee first, made the same way Linda taught me when we were newlyweds, and I burned everything I tried to cook. 2 scoops of Folgers in the ancient percolator that belonged to her mother. Water filled to the 6-cup line even though I only drink 2 cups and end up pouring the rest down the sink. The waste bothers me, but making a smaller pot would require acknowledging that I am cooking for one person now, and I am not ready for that particular surrender. I sit at the kitchen table where Linda and I shared breakfast for 4 decades, reading the Des Moines Register from front to back even though most of the news depresses me and the sports section covers teams I stopped caring about when I stopped having anyone to argue with about batting averages and coaching decisions. The obituary section has become my most faithful companion, a daily reminder that other men my age are departing this world with regularity, leaving behind widows who will have to learn their own choreography with emptiness. After breakfast, I walk through the house straightening things that don't need straightening, checking locks that are already secure, watering plants that Linda loved and that I keep alive out of duty rather than any real understanding of their needs. The African violets on the kitchen windowsill bloom purple and white flowers that seem almost defiant in their cheerfulness, as if they refuse to acknowledge that the woman who sang to them while she made breakfast isn't coming back to appreciate their efforts. The workshop behind the house has become my most painful destination, but I visit it every day like a pilgrim visiting a shrine to something he has lost faith in but cannot quite abandon. The tools hang exactly where I left them 3 years ago when Linda's second heart attack convinced me that she needed my full attention more than any piece of furniture needed my craftsmanship. My table saw sits under a canvas tarp that has collected enough dust to write my name in. And sometimes I do exactly that, tracing the letters FRA with my finger, and then wiping them away because seeing my name written in dust feels too much like visiting my own grave. The lumber rack still holds boards I bought for projects I will never complete. Oak and maple and cherry that has seasoned perfectly while waiting for purposes that no longer exist. I run my hands along the grain sometimes, feeling the potential that lives in every piece of wood, the chairs and tables and cabinets that could emerge if someone still cared enough to bring them into being. But my heart isn't in it anymore. And woodworking without passion produces nothing but sawdust and frustration. Linda used to say that watching me work was like watching a man have a conversation with the wood, that I seemed to know exactly what each board wanted to become before I made the first cut. She was right in a way I didn't fully understand until after she was gone and the wood stopped talking to me altogether. Without her presence in the workshop, without her humming and the soft sound of pages turning as she read her books, the lumber became just dead trees stacked in neat rows, waiting for someone who still believed in the magic of transformation. I have considered selling the tools, placing an ad in the local paper, and watching strangers carry away the implements of a craft I spent 60 years learning to master. But every time I reach for the phone to make that call, I hear Linda's voice reminding me that a man shouldn't sell his soul just because he has temporarily forgotten how to use it. She always believed I would find my way back to the workshop eventually, that the need to create was too much a part of who I am to disappear permanently. My son Michael calls every Sunday from Portland, where he works as a software engineer for a company that makes programs I don't understand for purposes I cannot imagine. He is a good man married to a nice woman named Sarah who sends Christmas cards with photos of their children. My grandchildren who live too far away to know me as anything more than a voice on the phone who sends birthday checks and remembers to ask about school and soccer games. Michael inherited his mother's kindness, but my stubbornness, a combination that makes him worry about me from a distance, while respecting my insistence that I am managing fine on my own. During our weekly conversations, Michael always asks if I am keeping busy, if I have been working on any projects, if I might consider moving to Portland, where he could keep an eye on me and the grandchildren could get to know their grandfather better. I always tell him I am doing fine, that Des Moines is my home, and I am not ready to leave the house where Linda and I built our life together. What I don't tell him is that some mornings I forget why I bothered getting out of bed, that some evenings I sit in my recliner until midnight watching programs. I don't remember that the silence in this house sometimes feels loud enough to drive a man crazy. The neighborhood around me has changed over the 42 years Linda and I lived on Maple Street, evolving from a community of young families to a collection of aging houses, occupied mostly by people like me who are marking time until their children decide they are too old to live independently. The Hendersons next door moved to Florida last spring, and their house was bought by a young couple with 2 small children who wave politely when they see me working in my garden, but who clearly consider me part of the landscape rather than someone they might want to know better. Mrs. Patterson across the street died last winter, and her house now belongs to her nephew from California, who is trying to sell it but seems unwilling to invest in the repairs that would make it attractive to potential buyers. The front porch sags and the shutters need paint, giving the whole place an abandoned look that makes me sad every time I see it. Mrs. Patterson used to bring me casseroles after Linda died, appearing at my door with covered dishes and gentle conversation that helped me through those first terrible months, when I didn't know how to live without the woman who had organized my days and given my life its rhythm. The mailbox at the end of my driveway receives mostly bills and advertisements addressed to Linda and Frank Kowalski, as if the post office hasn't gotten the memo that our household has been reduced by half and no longer needs 2 of anything. I have called multiple times to have Linda's name removed from the mailing lists, but companies apparently find it easier to mail to dead people than to update their databases. So Linda continues to receive offers for credit cards and magazine subscriptions and vacation packages to places we always planned to visit, but never found the time to explore together. On Wednesdays I drive my pickup truck to Miller's hardware store downtown, more out of habit than necessity, wandering the aisles where I once knew every clerk by name, and could find any item I needed without consulting the overhead signs. The store has been sold twice since I retired, and the new owners have rearranged everything according to some logic that makes sense to people who understand modern retail but confuses customers like me, who remember when nails were kept with nails and lumber was stored with lumber, rather than scattered throughout the store based on computer algorithms that prioritize profit margins over common sense. I usually buy something small and unnecessary, a package of screws or a tube of wood glue, just to justify the trip and maintain my connection to the world of building and fixing that once defined my identity. The young clerks are polite but impatient, clearly uncertain how to help an old man who seems to be browsing without any specific purpose in mind. They don't understand that I am not really shopping for supplies but for the feeling of belonging somewhere that still smells like possibility and potential transformation. Sometimes I run into other retired contractors at Miller's Men I worked with on various projects over the decades who are also wandering the aisles with the lost look of craftsmen who no longer have craft to practice. We exchange pleasantries and updates about mutual acquaintances who have died or moved away. But our conversations feel hollow because we are all struggling with the same fundamental question. What does a man do with his hands when they are no longer needed to build anything that matters? Bill Kowalski, no relation despite the shared name, worked with me on a dozen kitchen remodels in the 1990s. And he stops by the house occasionally to drink coffee and complain about the way modern contractors cut corners and use inferior materials. He is bitter about his own retirement, angry that his pension isn't enough to maintain the lifestyle he expected, and frustrated that his son-in-law hired someone else to remodel the basement instead of asking for Bill's help. We sit in my kitchen commiserating about the world passing us by, two old men whose skills have been made obsolete by younger workers who are faster but not necessarily better. These visits from Bill leave me feeling worse rather than better, as if his bitterness is contagious and threatens to infect what remains of my own optimism about the future. I find myself looking forward to his departure almost as much as his arrival, grateful for the company but exhausted by the negativity that seems to follow him like a shadow. After he leaves, I walk through the house opening windows to let in fresh air that might carry away the residue of his complaints and disappointment. The evenings are the hardest part of each day, when the silence becomes most noticeable and the emptiness most profound. I sit in my brown leather recliner, the one Linda gave me for my 60th birthday, because she said every man needed a proper chair for watching television and thinking about important matters. The chair faces the window that looks out on the workshop, and sometimes I find myself staring at the building where I spent so many happy hours creating things that would outlast my own brief presence in this world. Linda used to sit in her own chair beside mine, reading her romance novels while I watched the news or educational programs about history and science. She would occasionally look up from her book to comment on something she would read or to ask my opinion about current events, and we would have conversations that meandered through topics both serious and silly, without either of us feeling the need to reach any particular conclusions. Those evening talks were among my favorite parts of each day, casual exchanges that confirmed we were still interested in each other's thoughts after decades of marriage. Now I watch television alone, flipping through channels without finding anything that holds my attention for more than a few minutes. The news is too depressing, the comedies too loud and crude, the documentaries too reminiscent of the kind of programs Linda and I used to watch together. I usually end up settling on old westerns or war movies, stories about men who knew their purpose and had clear enemies to fight, who lived in times when problems could be solved with direct action rather than endless negotiation and compromise. By 9 of the clock I am usually ready for bed, not because I am tired but because sleeping is the only way to end another day that has passed without meaning or accomplishment. I brush my teeth with the same thoroughness Linda taught me when we were young and she worried about dental bills we couldn't afford, then lie down in the bed where we slept together for 47 years. On my side of the mattress that still bears the impression of my body, while her side remains smooth and unused. Sleep comes easily enough, but my dreams are filled with the sound of the workshop when it was alive and productive. The whir of the table saw and the gentle tap of the hammer against wood. Linda's humming mixing with the familiar sounds of creation that once gave my life its rhythm and purpose. I wake sometimes thinking I hear those sounds, stumbling to the window to look at the workshop that sits dark and silent under the Iowa sky, as lifeless as a cemetery monument to ambitions that died with the woman who encouraged them. Everything changed on a Tuesday morning in October when the doorbell rang at 8:15, interrupting my ritual reading of the obituary section and the gentle depression that had become my most reliable companion. I wasn't expecting anyone, and unexpected visitors had become rare enough to make me nervous about who might be standing on my front porch at an hour when most sensible people were already at work or school. Through the peephole I saw a small boy, maybe 9 or 10 years old, wearing a backpack that looked too big for his thin frame, and holding what appeared to be a broken wooden toy in his hands. His dark hair was uncombed, and his clothes looked like he had dressed himself without adult supervision, mismatched but clean in the way that suggested someone cared about his appearance, even if they weren't there to oversee the details. I opened the door cautiously, the way Linda always told me to do when strangers appeared unexpectedly, ready to close it quickly if the situation seemed suspicious or dangerous. But this was just a kid, small for his age and looking up at me with eyes that held more worry than any child should have to carry. He stood there for a moment without speaking, as if he had rehearsed what he wanted to say but forgotten the words now that he was actually facing me. "Are you the man who builds things?" he asked. Finally, his voice barely above a whisper, holding up the broken toy which I could now see was a wooden train car with one wheel missing and a crack running along the side. "My neighbor Mrs. Garcia said, you used to fix things for people, and maybe you could fix Charlie for me." I looked down at this serious little boy who had somehow tracked me down based on neighborhood gossip from a woman I barely knew, who had walked to my house before school to ask for help with something that was clearly important to him, even if it looked like junk to anyone else. The wooden train car was crudely made, painted bright red with yellow wheels, the kind of toy that comes from a discount store and breaks within a week of purchase. "Who is Charlie?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer from the way he held the broken toy like it contained something precious and irreplaceable. "He is my train," the boy said, his voice getting smaller as if he was afraid I might laugh at him for naming a toy. "My dad made him for me before he went to Afghanistan. He said Charlie would keep me safe while he was gone. But last night, Tommy Morrison threw him against the fence and broke his wheel off. I looked everywhere, but I cannot find the piece that came off." I felt something shift inside my chest, a familiar stirring that I hadn't experienced in 3 years. The same feeling I used to get when someone brought me a broken chair or a damaged cabinet that needed my attention. This wasn't about the toy. Not really. This was about a little boy whose father was deployed overseas, and whose most treasured possession had been damaged by someone who didn't understand its value. "What is your name, son?" I asked, stepping aside to let him into the house, though I wasn't sure what I was going to do with him once he was inside. "Danny Rodriguez," he said, wiping his nose with the back of his hand, and looking around my living room with the wide-eyed curiosity of a child who rarely gets invited into adult spaces. "I live 3 blocks over on Oak Street with my mom and my grandma. Mom works 2 jobs and grandma takes care of me after school, but she doesn't know how to fix things like this." Danny sat on the edge of my sofa holding Charlie carefully in his lap while I examined the damage with the kind of attention I once brought to fine furniture repair. The wheel had snapped off cleanly where it attached to the axle, and the crack in the side had been caused by the impact with whatever Tommy Morrison had thrown it against. It wasn't a complicated repair, but it would require some skill and the right materials to make it look like it had never been broken. "I can fix Charlie," I told Danny, and watching his face light up with hope made me remember why I used to love this work so much. "But it is going to take a few hours, and I will need to make a new wheel because I don't think we are going to find the original piece. Can you come back after school?" Danny nodded eagerly, then stopped and looked worried again. "I don't have any money to pay you," he said, his voice dropping back to that whisper that suggested he expected to be turned away once I learned he couldn't afford my services. "But I could do chores or something if you want." I looked at this earnest little boy who was trying to negotiate payment for services he desperately needed but couldn't afford. And I felt Linda's presence so strongly that I almost turned around expecting to see her standing in the doorway. This was exactly the kind of situation she would have handled with immediate compassion, offering help without making the recipient feel like charity case. "Tell you what," I said, falling into the rhythm of conversation that Linda had always used with children, treating them like complete people whose concerns deserved serious attention. "You can help me fix Charlie. I could use an assistant who knows him better than I do." Someone who can make sure I get the details right. Does that sound like a fair trade? Danny's face transformed with a smile that reminded me why Linda and I had always regretted not having grandchildren living close enough to spoil properly. He carefully placed Charlie on my coffee table like he was entrusting me with something infinitely valuable, then shouldered his backpack and headed for the door with the purposeful stride of someone who had important business to attend to. "I will be back at 3:30. He called over his shoulder as he ran down my front walk toward school, leaving me alone with a broken toy and a sense of purpose I hadn't felt since Linda got sick, and I stopped believing that fixing things could make a meaningful difference in anyone's life. I carried Charlie out to the workshop, switching on lights that hadn't been used in 3 years, and feeling the familiar comfort of being surrounded by tools that knew how to solve problems through patient application of skill and attention to detail. The workshop smelled like dust and abandonment, but underneath those odors I could still detect the ghost of wood stain and pine, Sol and the lavender lotion Linda used to wear, scents that made this space feel like home in ways the house itself no longer managed. I cleared a space on my workbench and examined Charlie more carefully under the bright task lighting that Linda had insisted I install after she caught me squinting at delicate work one too many times. The toy was amateur work, clearly made by someone with good intentions, but limited skill, someone who cared more about creating something meaningful than producing something beautiful. The joints were secured with wood glue and small nails rather than proper joinery, and the paint had been applied with a brush that left visible strokes, rather than the smooth finish that came from patient sanding and multiple thin coats. But there was love in this crude construction, evidence of careful attention to details that only the recipient would notice. Someone had taken the time to paint tiny windows on the sides of the train car and to add small metal details that looked like they had been salvaged from other toys or household items. The wheels were turned from solid wood rather than purchased from a craft store, and each one was slightly different in a way that suggested hand crafting rather than mass production. This was the work of a father who wanted to create something special for his son but didn't have access to proper tools or materials. Someone who had used whatever was available to build something that would carry his love across whatever distance military service would create between them. Looking at Charlie, I could imagine Danny's father working late at night, in some makeshift workspace, sanding rough edges with whatever sandpaper he could find, and painting careful details with a brush he had borrowed from someone else's supply kit. I spent the morning cleaning and organizing the workshop, removing dust covers from tools I hadn't touched in 3 years, and checking to make sure everything still worked properly. My table saw started on the second pull, and the sound of its motor filled the workshop with a familiar confidence that made my hands remember skills I thought they had forgotten. I checked the alignment on my miter gauge and the fence settings on my router table, running through the maintenance routines that had once been automatic, but now required conscious effort to recall. By lunchtime, I had located everything I would need to repair Charlie properly. A piece of maple that would match the original wheels, sandpaper and progressively finer grits, wood stain that approximated the original color, and clear lacquer that would protect the repair from future damage. I also found a tube of wood glue that was still good despite sitting unused for 3 years, and a set of small files that would let me shape the replacement wheel to match the originals as closely as possible. I made myself a sandwich and ate it in the workshop while reviewing my repair plan, something I hadn't done since the early days of my career when every project required careful planning, because I couldn't afford to waste materials on mistakes. The wheel would need to be turned on my lathe, then drilled to accommodate the axle, then stained and finished to match the rest of the train. The crack in the side could be filled with wood putty, sanded smooth, and touched up with paint that matched the original color. At 3:15, I found myself standing at the front window watching for Danny like Linda used to watch for me to come home from work, eager to share the details of her day and hear about mine. When I saw him running down Maple Street with his backpack bouncing against his shoulders, I felt a flutter of excitement that reminded me why I had chosen woodworking as a career 50 years earlier. There was something magical about taking broken things and making them whole again, about using skill and patience to restore function and beauty to objects that other people might consider beyond saving. Danny burst through my front door like a small tornado, dropping his backpack in the entryway and heading straight for the coffee table where he had left Charlie that morning. When he saw that the train wasn't there, his face fell with disappointment that was quickly replaced by understanding when I explained that Charlie was in the workshop undergoing surgery. "Can I watch?" he asked, following me through the house toward the back door with the kind of enthusiasm I remembered from my own childhood when I was allowed to observe my grandfather working on projects that seemed impossibly complex and fascinating. I promise I will not touch anything or get in the way. I showed Danny around the workshop, explaining what each tool was designed to do and letting him hold some of the smaller implements while I described their proper use and safety requirements. He listened with the intense concentration of someone who genuinely wanted to understand not just what I was doing but why I was doing it that particular way. His questions were intelligent and showed that he was thinking about the process rather than just waiting for me to finish. "Why do you have to sand it so many times?" he asked as I worked on the replacement wheel with progressively finer grades of sandpaper, moving from coarse to medium to fine in the patient progression that separated amateur work from professional results. "Because wood is like skin," I explained, falling into the teaching rhythm that had once made me popular with apprentices who worked on my construction crews. If you want the stain to go on evenly and the finish to look smooth, you have to remove all the scratches left by the previous grade of sandpaper. Each step makes the scratches smaller until they are so small you cannot see them anymore. Danny nodded seriously and watched me work through each step of the process, asking questions about why I chose particular tools and techniques, why some woods were harder to work with than others, why finishing was just as important as construction when it came to making something that would last. His curiosity reminded me of my own eagerness to learn when I was his age, and everything about woodworking seemed like magic performed by adults who possessed secret knowledge about how to transform raw materials into useful objects. As I worked on Charlie, I found myself talking about Linda and how she used to sit in the workshop reading while I worked on projects. How her presence had made even the most routine repairs feel like important endeavors because she was there to witness and appreciate the transformation. Danny listened to these stories with the respectful attention that children sometimes bring to adult revelations, sensing that he was being trusted with information that mattered, even if he didn't fully understand its significance. "She sounds nice," he said when I finished a story about Linda, insisting that I take time to teach neighborhood children basic woodworking skills even when I was too busy with paying customers to want to bother with amateur instruction. "My dad says my mom is the nicest person in the world. But I think maybe your wife was nice too." The simple generosity of this observation, the way Danny made room in his understanding for multiple people to be good without diminishing his loyalty to his own family, reminded me why children often understood important truths that adults complicated with unnecessary analysis. Linda would have loved this boy, would have insisted that I teach him everything I could about working with wood, and would have made sure he felt welcome in our house whenever he wanted to visit. By 5 o'clock, Charlie was completely repaired, his new wheel stained and finished to match the originals, the crack in his side filled and painted so carefully that you had to know where to look to find evidence of the damage. I had also taken the liberty of sanding the entire train car and applying a fresh coat of clear finish that would protect the wood from future wear and make the colors more vibrant than they had been when Danny first brought him to me. Danny held Charlie up to the light, examining my work with the careful attention of a quality control inspector who took his responsibilities seriously. He rolled the train back and forth on my workbench, testing the new wheel to make sure it rolled smoothly and didn't wobble or stick. When he was satisfied that Charlie was fully functional again, he looked up at me with gratitude that was almost overwhelming in its intensity. "He looks even better than before," Danny said, his voice full of wonder at the transformation that had occurred while he watched and asked questions. "My dad is going to be so happy when I send him a picture. He always said Charlie was tough enough to survive anything, and now I know he was right." I walked Danny home that evening, carrying his backpack while he clutched Charlie against his chest and chattered about everything he had learned in the workshop, about the different types of wood and which tools were best for particular jobs, and why patience was the most important skill a craftsman could develop. His enthusiasm was infectious, reminding me of my own excitement when I first discovered that I had the ability to create useful and beautiful objects with my hands. Danny's house on Oak Street was small but well maintained, with a neat garden and fresh paint that suggested someone cared about appearances, even if they didn't have much money to spend on improvements. His mother, Maria, answered the door, a tired-looking woman in her early 30s who was clearly getting ready to leave for what I assumed was her evening job. She thanked me for helping Danny and insisted on trying to pay me for my work, pulling a crumpled $20 bill from her purse despite my protests that the repair had been my pleasure. "Danny's been worried about Charlie for weeks," she explained, smoothing her son's hair while he showed her the perfectly repaired train car. "His father calls every Sunday, and Danny always tells him how Charlie is doing." I didn't know what I was going to say if we couldn't get him fixed. I assured Maria that no payment was necessary, that Danny had helped with the repair and that teaching him about woodworking had been more valuable to me than any money she could offer. But I could see that accepting charity was difficult for her, that she needed to feel like she was paying her own way even when kindness was freely offered. We compromised on her promise to let Danny help me with future projects if I ever needed an assistant, an arrangement that satisfied her sense of fairness while giving me something to look forward to. Walking home that evening, I felt lighter than I had in 3 years, as if fixing Charlie had somehow repaired something broken inside me as well. The workshop no longer felt like a mausoleum for abandoned dreams, but like a place where useful work could still be accomplished, where skills I had spent a lifetime developing could still make a meaningful difference in someone's life. That night, I called Michael in Portland and told him about Danny and Charlie, about how good it had felt to use my hands for something more productive than turning television channels and flipping through magazines. Michael sounded pleased but cautious, as if he was afraid to get too excited about his father's apparent emergence from the isolation that had worried him for 3 years. "Maybe you should think about doing more repairs for people," Michael suggested carefully, testing the waters to see if I was ready to consider rebuilding some version of the life I had abandoned when Linda died. "There must be other kids in the neighborhood who need help with things their parents don't know how to fix." I told Michael I would think about it, though part of me was already making plans to visit Mrs. Garcia the next day to let her know that I might be available for small repair jobs if people needed help with things that required more skill than they possessed. Word of mouth had always been my best advertising when I was working full-time, and I suspected that one satisfied customer like Danny could lead to others who needed the kind of help that only experienced hands could provide. As I lay in bed that night, I could hear Linda's voice encouraging me to stop hiding in grief and start living again, to use the gifts I had been given to serve people who needed what I had to offer. For the first time since her funeral, I fell asleep feeling excited about tomorrow, wondering what broken things might find their way to my door, and what stories they would bring with them about the people who loved them enough to seek help, rather than simply throwing them away. Word spread through the neighborhood faster than I expected, traveling through the network of mothers and grandmothers who kept track of everyone's business and needs with the efficiency of a small-town telephone system. By Thursday, Mrs. Garcia had called to ask if I could look at her kitchen cabinet door that wouldn't stay closed properly. By Friday, Tom Henderson from 2 streets over was knocking on my door with a broken picture frame that held his late wife's favorite photograph, asking if I could restore it to its original condition. Each repair that came to my workshop carried more emotional weight than its size or complexity would suggest, and I began to understand that I wasn't just fixing objects but helping people maintain connections to memories and relationships that mattered more than the monetary value of the items themselves. Mrs. Garcia's cabinet door had been installed by her late husband 30 years earlier, and keeping it functional was her way of preserving his presence in the kitchen, where he had made breakfast for her every morning until the day he died. Tom Henderson's picture frame contained the last professional photograph taken of his wife before cancer changed everything, and restoring it properly was about honoring her memory as much as displaying her image. I found myself looking forward to these visits from neighbors who brought me their broken treasures, each repair request accompanied by stories that helped me understand why seemingly insignificant objects could matter so much to the people who owned them. A jewelry box inherited from a grandmother, a toolbox passed down from father to son, a rocking chair where 3 generations of babies had been comforted during teething and nightmares. These weren't just things to be fixed, but pieces of family history that deserved careful attention and respect. Danny became my unofficial assistant, stopping by after school whenever he didn't have homework or other obligations, eager to learn new techniques and help with projects that were appropriate for his skill level. I taught him how to hold sandpaper properly to avoid creating scratches, how to apply wood stain with smooth strokes that wouldn't leave visible marks, how to use measuring tools to ensure that repairs would be precise and durable. His enthusiasm reminded me why I had always enjoyed working with apprentices, how teaching someone else forced me to think more carefully about techniques I usually performed automatically. But the increased activity in my workshop also brought back memories I wasn't prepared to handle. Moments when muscle memory would make me reach for a tool that Linda had handed me or turn to share an observation with someone who wasn't there anymore. The familiar sounds and smells of active woodworking carried emotional associations that had been safely buried during the 3 years when I avoided the workshop altogether. And now they emerged unexpectedly to ambush me with grief. I thought I had finished processing. One afternoon, while Danny and I were working on a repair to Mrs. Patterson's old sewing cabinet, I found myself telling him about Linda's habit of humming while I worked, how that gentle melody had become so much a part of my workshop routine that I still listened for it even though I knew it would never return. Danny absorbed this information with the serious consideration he brought to everything I told him about woodworking and life, then surprised me by starting to hum a tune his grandmother sang while she cooked, filling the workshop with a different melody that somehow honored Linda's memory while creating new associations for the space. "My grandma says music makes work go better," Danny explained when he noticed me listening to his humming with more attention than the simple task at hand seemed to require. "She hums when she is cooking, and when she is folding laundry, and when she is tired, but still has things to do." Maybe Mrs. Linda knew that too. The innocent wisdom of this observation, the way Danny connected his grandmother's habits to Linda's without making comparisons or judgments, helped me understand that the workshop could accommodate new memories without betraying old ones. Linda would have approved of Danny's presence here, would have encouraged me to share my knowledge with someone young enough to appreciate learning and carry the skills forward into his own life. As autumn turned toward winter, my small repair business grew beyond what I could comfortably handle alone, but I was reluctant to expand or formalize the operation because I didn't want to recreate the pressures and obligations that had made me eager to retire in the first place. I was enjoying the flexibility of working only on projects that interested me, of setting my own schedule and choosing customers based on whether their stories touched something in my heart, rather than their ability to pay premium prices for quick turnaround. Michael noticed the change in my voice during our Sunday phone calls, a return of energy and purpose that had been missing for 3 years. He started talking about visiting for Christmas, bringing Sarah and the grandchildren to see the workshop that had become active again, and to meet Danny, who had apparently become an important part of my weekly routine. The prospect of having family in the house for the holidays excited me in ways I hadn't expected, making me realize how much I missed the bustle and conversation that came with multiple generations sharing meals and stories around the same table. But Michael's enthusiasm also made me nervous about what expectations he might be developing for my future, whether he was interpreting my renewed activity as a sign that I was ready to make major changes in my living situation or lifestyle. I was comfortable with the small steps I had taken toward re-engaging with life, but I wasn't sure I was ready for dramatic departures from the routine I had established as a widower learning to live alone. The workshop had become a sanctuary where I could control the pace and scope of challenges I was willing to accept, where success was measured in satisfied customers and properly completed repairs rather than productivity metrics or profit margins. I was afraid that too much expansion or too many expectations might turn this peaceful refuge back into a source of stress and obligation, destroying the therapeutic value it had developed as a place where I could use my skills without pressure. Danny seemed to understand my ambivalence about growth and change better than the adults who kept suggesting ways I could expand or monetize my renewed interest in woodworking. He never pushed me to take on projects that seemed too complex or time-consuming. Never suggested that I should advertise my services or establish regular business hours that would make me accessible to customers on their schedule rather than mine. His presence in the workshop was comfortable precisely because it demanded nothing beyond what I was ready to give and appreciated everything I was willing to share. One evening in November, while we were working on a dollhouse repair for a neighbor's granddaughter, Danny asked me if I missed Mrs. Linda more when I was working or when I wasn't working. The question surprised me with its directness and insight, forcing me to think about something I had been feeling but hadn't articulated even to myself. "I miss her all the time," I admitted, pausing in my work to consider the complexity of grief that could be both heavier and lighter, depending on circumstances I didn't fully understand. "But when I am working, I miss her in a way that feels closer to love than sadness. Does that make sense?" Danny nodded seriously, his young face thoughtful in the way that children sometimes become when they are processing information that seems important, even if they don't completely understand it. "My dad says he misses us more when he is not busy," because that is when he has time to think about how far away we are. But when he is working, he misses us like he is saving up stories to tell us when he comes home. This observation struck me as profound in its simplicity, capturing something essential about how memory and longing could coexist with productive activity in ways that honored what was lost, while embracing what remained possible. Working in the workshop didn't eliminate my grief for Linda, but it transformed it into something more bearable. A presence rather than an absence. A continuation of conversations we had been having for 47 years rather than an ending that required only silence and regret. As Christmas approached, I found myself planning for Michael's visit with enthusiasm that surprised me. I cleaned the house more thoroughly than I had since Linda's funeral, replacing burned out light bulbs and washing windows that had been gathering dust for 3 years. I started planning meals that would accommodate everyone's dietary preferences and scheduling workshop time so that Michael's children could see their grandfather working on projects that demonstrated skills they had only heard about in stories. Danny helped me organize the workshop so that it would be ready for visitors who might want to understand what we did there and why it mattered to both of us. We created a display of completed projects that showed the range of repairs I had tackled since returning to active work, from simple picture frame restoration to complex furniture reconstruction that required multiple techniques and several weeks of patient attention to detail. Danny wrote small cards explaining what each project had meant to its owner, turning our workshop into a gallery that told stories about the intersection of craftsmanship and human relationships. The anticipation of Michael's visit forced me to confront questions about my future that I had been avoiding since Linda's death. Decisions about whether I wanted to continue living alone in a house that was larger than one person needed, whether I was ready to consider changes that might bring me closer to my son and his family. But these questions no longer felt overwhelming or urgent because I was no longer the same man who had been paralyzed by grief and uncertainty 3 years earlier. Working in the workshop again had reminded me that I still possessed skills and knowledge that could make a meaningful difference in other people's lives. That retirement didn't have to mean withdrawal from all productive activity, but could instead mean freedom to choose work that mattered for reasons beyond financial necessity. Danny's friendship had shown me that meaningful relationships could develop in unexpected ways when you remained open to possibilities, rather than closing yourself off from anything that might require effort or emotional investment. But I also recognized that the progress I had made was fragile, dependent on maintaining a balance between engagement and solitude that allowed me to contribute without overwhelming myself with obligations I wasn't ready to handle. The workshop had become a bridge between the isolation that had characterized my first 3 years of widowhood and whatever form of social connection I might be ready to embrace. As I continued learning to live without Linda, while honoring everything she had taught me about love and service. Michael arrived 3 days before Christmas with Sarah and my 2 grandchildren, Emma and Sam, who had grown so much since their last visit that I barely recognized them as the small children who had once needed booster seats at my dining room table. Emma was now 12. All legs and attitude and opinions about everything from school policies to environmental protection, while 8-year-old Sam remained the gentle observer he had always been, more likely to ask thoughtful questions than make dramatic pronouncements about the state of the world. The house came alive in ways I had forgotten were possible, filled with voices and laughter and the cheerful chaos that comes with children who aren't accustomed to tiptoeing around adult feelings or maintaining the careful quiet that had characterized my life for 3 years. Emma immediately claimed Linda's chair in the living room, declaring it the perfect spot for reading the mystery novel she would brought from Portland, while Sam gravitated toward the kitchen where he could watch me prepare meals and ask detailed questions about ingredients and cooking techniques that Linda had taught me decades earlier. Danny arrived on Christmas Eve morning as I had invited him to do, carrying a wrapped present and wearing his best clothes with the careful attention to appearance that suggested his mother had supervised his preparation for this visit. He was nervous about meeting my family, uncertain how to behave around people he had heard stories about but never actually encountered. But Emma and Sam accepted his presence with the casual generosity that children often show toward their grandparents' friends, when no adults have suggested that differences in age or background should matter. I introduced Danny as my workshop assistant and friend, explaining how he would brought Charlie to me for repair and gradually become an important part of my weekly routine. Michael seemed pleased to meet the boy who had played such a significant role in my return to active woodworking. And Sarah immediately began asking Danny questions about his family and school with the kind of genuine interest that made him relax, and start talking about his favorite subjects and his father's upcoming return from deployment. The workshop tour I had planned became a spontaneous celebration of everything Danny and I had accomplished together over the past 3 months. Emma was fascinated by the precision required for furniture repair, asking technical questions about joinery, and finishing that demonstrated she had inherited my analytical approach to problem solving. Sam was more interested in the stories behind each project, wanting to know who had owned the items we had repaired, and why those objects had been important enough to restore rather than replace. This is where Papa taught me how to sand without making scratches. Danny explained to Sam, demonstrating the proper technique with a piece of scrap wood, while I watched proudly from across the workshop. And this is where we fixed Charlie so he looks even better than when my dad made him. Papa says good repairs should be invisible, like they never happened at all. Watching Danny teach Sam the same lessons I would taught him made me understand that knowledge and skills could live beyond their original recipients when they were shared with genuine care and attention. Linda had always said that the best gifts were the ones that kept giving long after the initial exchange, and seeing Danny pass along woodworking techniques to my grandson felt like evidence of that principle in action. Michael spent an hour in the workshop examining tools he remembered from his childhood, asking about modifications I had made to equipment over the years and sharing memories of projects we had worked on together when he was young enough to be impressed by his father's ability to create useful objects from raw materials. His questions revealed how much attention he would paid to my work even during periods when he had seemed more interested in sports or friends than in learning traditional crafts. I always regretted not spending more time out here with you, Michael admitted while examining the lathe I had used to turn Danny's replacement wheel for Charlie. I was too busy being a teenager and then too focused on college and career to appreciate what you were trying to teach me. Maybe it is not too late to learn some of these skills. His words carried a wistfulness that reminded me of my own regrets about opportunities I had missed with Linda. Times when I had been too focused on immediate concerns to appreciate the simple pleasure of shared attention to tasks that mattered more for their process than their outcome. But regret could become a teacher if you let it, showing you what to pay attention to in whatever time remained available for connection and learning. That evening, while Sarah helped Danny's mother prepare Christmas Eve dinner at their house, I sat with my family in the living room where Linda and I had spent so many quiet evenings together, watching my grandchildren play board games while Michael and I talked about changes we would both experienced since his last visit. The house felt full in ways that had nothing to do with the number of people present, and everything to do with the quality of attention we were paying to each other. Emma had appointed herself the official family photographer, documenting everything from Sam's workshop lesson, to Danny's demonstration of Charlie's repaired wheel, to Michael's reunion with tools he remembered from childhood. Her pictures would become a record of this visit that we could all reference when we returned to our separate routines. Evidence of connections that would persist despite geographical distance and different daily concerns. Grandpa Frank looks happier than I have seen him in years. I overheard Sarah tell Michael while they thought I was absorbed in helping Sam with a particularly challenging board game move. There is something different about him now, like he has found a reason to care about things again. Her observation was accurate in ways that surprised me because I hadn't consciously recognized the change myself until she named it. The purposeless drifting that had characterized my first 3 years of retirement had been replaced by something that felt more like engagement with life as it actually was, rather than as I had expected it to be. Working in the workshop again hadn't eliminated my grief for Linda, but it had given that grief a context where it could coexist with productivity and service, and the satisfaction that came from using skills I had spent a lifetime developing. Christmas morning brought an exchange of gifts that revealed how much thought everyone had put into celebrating this reunion. After 3 years of perfunctory holiday phone calls and mailed packages that arrived on time but carried little emotional weight beyond obligation, Emma had made me a wooden pencil holder in her shop class at school, demonstrating that she had inherited both manual skills and the desire to create useful objects with her hands. Sam had written a story about a grandfather who built magical toys that came to life to help children solve problems, a narrative that clearly drew inspiration from the Charlie repair he had witnessed. Danny arrived after lunch with his mother Maria and his grandmother Rosa, carrying a present he had made for me in secret with help from his family. It was a small wooden plaque with the words Frank's Workshop burned into the surface using a technique he had learned from a friend's father, decorated with painted details that showed more artistic talent than I had realized he possessed. The gift represented hours of careful work and planning, evidence of how much our friendship had come to mean to him. "I wanted you to have something that would remind you of all the things we fixed together," Danny explained, while I examined his handiwork with the careful attention it deserved. My mom helped with the painting, and my grandma taught me how to make the letters look professional, but I did all the burning myself. The plaque went immediately onto the workshop wall where I could see it from my primary workbench, a permanent reminder of how much joy could be found in sharing knowledge with someone young enough to appreciate learning and patient enough to master techniques that required practice and persistence. Danny's gift represented more than artistic achievement. It was proof that our working relationship had become a genuine friendship that enriched both our lives in ways that neither of us had anticipated when he first knocked on my door with a broken toy train. Michael's gift to me was a new set of carving chisels that he had selected with advice from a woodworker in Portland who specialized in fine furniture restoration. The tools were better quality than anything I had owned before, designed for precision work that required the kind of patience and skill that could only be developed over decades of practice. Receiving them felt like recognition that my workshop activities had evolved beyond simple repairs into something that deserved investment in proper equipment. "I thought maybe you would want to try some new techniques," Michael explained while I examined each chisel with the reverence that quality tools always inspired in craftsmen who understood their value. The man at the woodworking store said these were the kind of chisels that could last several generations if they were properly maintained and used for appropriate projects. The implication that my skills might be worth passing down to future generations was both humbling and encouraging, suggesting that Michael saw my workshop activities as more than casual hobby, but as continuation of family traditions that connected us across time and distance. Linda had always said that the most valuable inheritances were knowledge and skills rather than money or possessions, and receiving tools that were designed to outlast my own lifetime felt like acknowledgement of that principle. New Year's Eve arrived too quickly, marking the end of a visit that had reminded me how much I had missed being part of a larger family unit, where individual concerns were balanced against collective needs and shared celebrations. As we prepared for Michael's departure, I found myself thinking about changes I might want to make in the coming year, ways to maintain the connections we had renewed, while respecting everyone's need for independence and separate lives. Danny had become such a regular presence in the workshop that his absence during the family visit had left a noticeable gap in my daily routine. When he resumed his after-school visits, he brought new questions inspired by watching me interact with Emma and Sam, curiosities about how skills and knowledge could be shared across generations and geographical distances. His relationship with my grandchildren had shown him possibilities for friendship that transcended age differences when people found common interests and mutual respect. "Do you think Emma would want to learn woodworking?" Danny asked one afternoon while we worked on a jewelry box repair that required techniques he was still mastering. "She seemed really interested in how you measure things so precisely, and she asked good questions about why some wood is harder to work with than other kinds." His question made me realize that my workshop could become a connection point for multiple relationships, a place where skills and knowledge could be shared with anyone who approached with genuine curiosity and willingness to learn. Michael had mentioned that Emma was frustrated with the limited scope of her school's shop classes, and extending an invitation for summer workshop visits might provide enrichment that would benefit both of us while strengthening family bonds that geography made difficult to maintain. As winter gave way to spring, my small repair business continued to grow through word of mouth recommendations from satisfied customers who appreciated the care and attention I brought to projects that other people might consider too small or unprofitable to justify professional service. I was turning down more work than I accepted, choosing projects based on whether they seemed likely to provide learning opportunities for Danny and satisfaction for me, rather than on their potential profitability or prestige. The workshop had become a place where time moved at a different pace than the rest of the world, where problems could be solved through patience and skill rather than speed and efficiency. Danny's presence there had taught me that knowledge gained value when it was shared with someone who could use it to create their own meaningful projects, that teaching could be as satisfying as creating when approached with the right spirit and attention. One morning in early May, I received a phone call from Danny's mother telling me that his father would be returning from Afghanistan in 2 weeks, and that Danny was so excited he could barely sleep or concentrate on schoolwork. The news filled me with happiness for Danny's family reunion, and with anxiety about how his father's return might change our friendship and workshop routine. I had grown accustomed to Danny's regular presence and contribution to projects that we had been developing together over 8 months of collaboration. He talks about you and the workshop constantly. Maria assured me when she sensed my concern about whether our relationship would continue after her husband's return. Carlos is grateful that Danny has had such a positive male influence while he has been deployed, and he would like to meet you when he gets settled back home. The prospect of meeting Danny's father brought up feelings I hadn't anticipated, a combination of pride in what Danny and I had accomplished together and nervousness about whether Carlos would approve of the friendship that had developed between his son and an elderly neighbor he would never met. I wanted to be respectful of the family relationships that would resume with his return, while maintaining the connection with Danny that had become important to both of us. 2 weeks later, Danny brought his father to the workshop for an introduction that felt more significant than a casual meeting between neighbors. Carlos Rodriguez was a compact man in his early 30s with the bearing of someone accustomed to responsibility and authority. But his warmth toward Danny and gratitude toward me was immediately apparent in the way he listened to his son explain various projects we had completed together. "Danny has told me so much about what you have taught him," Carlos said while examining the repaired Charlie that had started our friendship 8 months earlier. "This kind of attention to detail and craftsmanship is exactly what I hoped he would learn while I was away. I cannot thank you enough for being such a positive influence during a difficult time for our family." Carlos's appreciation for what Danny and I had built together was genuine and generous, showing understanding that their family had benefited from community support during his deployment, and that those relationships could continue to enrich everyone involved, rather than being replaced by returning family dynamics. His military experience had apparently taught him to value networks of mutual assistance that strengthened communities and families rather than competing with them. "Would it be possible for me to help with some projects?" Carlos asked after Danny had shown him every corner of the workshop and explained the function of tools he had learned to use safely. "I have some mechanical skills from the Army, and I would like to contribute something to the place that has been so important to Danny's development." His request to participate, rather than simply observe, demonstrated respect for what Danny and I had created together, while offering to add value, rather than taking over or redirecting our activities. Over the following months, Carlos became a regular weekend visitor to the workshop, bringing different skills and perspectives that complemented what Danny and I had been doing while maintaining the collaborative spirit that made our work together enjoyable, rather than stressful. As summer approached, Michael called to ask if I would be interested in having Emma visit for 2 weeks to participate in what he called Advanced Grandfather Camp, that would include intensive workshop instruction and cultural exploration of Iowa from the perspective of someone who had lived there for 7 decades. The invitation felt like recognition that the workshop had become something worth sharing with family members who were ready to appreciate what it could offer. Emma arrived in June with enthusiasm that reminded me of Danny's eagerness to learn, combined with technical knowledge from her school shop classes that allowed us to tackle more complex projects than I had attempted since returning to active woodworking. She wanted to build a jewelry box for her mother's birthday, a project that would require multiple techniques and several weeks of careful attention to achieve the quality she envisioned. Watching Emma and Danny work together on parallel projects taught me about the different ways that young people approached learning when they felt supported, rather than pressured, encouraged rather than judged. Emma brought systematic analysis and careful planning to her work, while Danny contributed intuitive understanding and willingness to experiment with techniques that might not succeed, but could lead to creative solutions. Their different strengths complemented each other in ways that made both their projects more successful than either could have achieved working alone. By the end of Emma's visit, she had completed the jewelry box and Danny had finished a toolbox for his father that demonstrated advanced joinery techniques we had been practicing for months. More importantly, both young people had experienced the satisfaction that comes from creating something beautiful and functional with their own hands, something that would last long enough to remind them of what they had learned during summer afternoons, in an old man's workshop where time moved slowly enough for careful work and patient instruction. As autumn returned and Danny prepared to start 4th grade while Emma began her final year of middle school, I reflected on how much my life had changed since that October morning, when a broken toy train had brought purpose back to my workshop and friendship back to my daily routine. The isolation that had characterized my first 3 years of widowhood had been replaced by connections that enriched my days while honoring Linda's memory through service to young people who reminded me why teaching and learning mattered more than individual achievement. The workshop that had been silent for 3 years now buzzed with activity most afternoons and weekends, a place where broken things were restored, and young people learned skills that would serve them throughout their lives. Danny's friendship had shown me that meaningful relationships could develop across generational boundaries when people found common interests and mutual respect. Emma's summer visit had demonstrated that family connections could be strengthened through shared projects that created lasting memories and tangible evidence of time well spent together. Standing in my workshop at 74, surrounded by tools that Linda had encouraged me to keep and projects that honored her belief in the value of service to others, I understood that the most important repairs I had made had been to my own sense of purpose and connection. Danny's broken train had led me back to work that mattered, and through that work I had discovered that retirement didn't have to mean withdrawal from meaningful activity, but could instead mean freedom to choose how to use skills and knowledge accumulated over a lifetime. The sound of young voices in my workshop, asking questions and sharing discoveries, and celebrating small triumphs over technical challenges, had replaced Linda's humming as the soundtrack of my most productive and satisfying hours. She would have loved Danny and Emma, would have insisted that I teach them everything I could about woodworking and life, and the importance of using whatever gifts you have been given to help other people when they need what you have to offer. Tonight, as I turn off the workshop lights and lock the door behind me, I can hear Linda's voice reminding me that love multiplies when you share it, that the best way to honor what we built together is to keep building with whatever materials and opportunities life provides. At 74, I am finally beginning to understand that the most important things we create aren't made of wood and nails but of attention and patience, and the willingness to see potential in broken things that other people might consider beyond repair. The workshop in my heart will always belong partly to Linda, but there is room for new voices and fresh projects, and the kind of surprise that comes when you answer your door to find a small boy holding something precious that needs fixing. Sometimes the most important work we do is simply showing up when people need us, ready to listen to their stories and offer whatever skills we possess to help them restore what matters most.